I'm also worried about the use of online safety acts and the like to censor people who have unpopular opinions, because that's how it'll be used, right? But equally, I do have some faith that we can distinguish between material that's palpably wrong and material that's politically contentious.
Welcome to Burning Platforms, our fortnightly look at the intersection between tech and politics, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week, we look at the legal issues around AI companion technology with consumer lawyer specialist Professor Jeannie Peterson. But first, a rundown of the latest news from around the world with our regular panel, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. So welcome to another episode of Burning Platforms. Joining us in the virtual saloon, I think we're going to call it this week, is my regular panelist, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch. G'day, Lizzie.
Hi, Peter.
And the great Dan Stinton, CEO of Health Engine. G'day, Dan.
G'day, Peter. G'day, Lizzie.
And special guest this week who's going to talk to us about automated emotional connection and carers and pets or whatever. Jeannie Peterson, thanks for joining us, Jeannie, and we'll be digging deep into how machines can make us feel better or not in a little while. But first, let's go through some of the highlights from around the world, or I don't even know if we call them highlights or lowlights. But Lizzie, I thought we'd start with the protests that have been breaking out across England after that terrible murder of the young girls at a Taylor Swift dance school, and the misinformation that spread about the perpetrator of that violence, and it became an asylum seeker, and it led to protests, and it's led to a whole lot of different through lines, but the one that I'm particularly interested in was the Lord Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, raising concerns that the online safety laws that they had brought in not that long ago weren't fit for purpose. So what's going on, and what should we learn from watching what's happening over there as we think through our e-safety commissioner extending her powers?
Yeah, it's probably a bit fairer to call them riots rather than protests, in the sense that it looks like they were targeting immigrants, immigrant-owned businesses, people who weren't white. There's all sorts of really nasty stories coming out of parts of England of people being stopped in their cars and being allowed to go through if they're white and not if they weren't. So just a really horrible set of violent evenings in a number of towns. I would also say as well, lots of counter protests to that were, I think, pretty inspiring. So some forms of resistance to that. But the issue around digital spaces is that there was an argument going around, and I think this is gaining traction, that a big driver of this was online influencers, people like Andrew Tate, people like Tommy Robinson, far-right leaders, and people who are known for being very controversial and having quite retrograde views, influencing this narrative that immigrants are to blame for all the problems in England. And this has been then the source of criticism for the Online Safety Act for not having sufficient powers to deal with what has been called mis and disinformation. The Online Safety Act in the UK is similar in some ways to the Online Safety Act in Australia, in that it has some capacity for a regulator to take down certain kinds of content. It's got a similar kind of regime for a co-regulatory approach to working with industry to have takedown approaches for illegal content like child sex abuse material and terror content and the like. But it's also got other things in there as well, like specific offences. And there's other parts that are specifically directed at mis and disinformation that don't exist in our Online Safety Act, were mooted to be brought in via an act there was a public exposure draft of it that didn't go well here, and they're reconsidering that approach. But the mis and disinformation issue is dealt with fairly and squarely in the Online Safety Act in the UK, at least through their regulator. And there's queries from leading political figures as to whether these need to be beefed up so that they can do more to kind of tackle these problems. I think this is an interesting debate because I fear that the concept of online safety is now so broad it's almost meaningless because it covers all sorts of things that go wrong in the real world and then attributing that back to platforms. And sometimes I wonder if there's a bit of a tendency to do that, to blame online environments in circumstances where there's much bigger, broader issues or reasons for these kinds of breakouts of political violence and rioting in the UK at least. So I think there is a longer time frame for understanding where these riots have come from. That doesn't mean that I don't think there's more that could be done in relation to platforms who do end up profiting off these kinds of explosive moments in our political and public life. And I think it's interesting to see what different commentators think should be happening. And Frances Haugen is in Australia, and she gave an interview on the ABC and she talked about some of these topics, and I thought she was pretty on the money. She talks about how Europe has an approach that looks further back than just the harms itself and seeking to take down content at that stage, but in fact looking at the business models. And I think that's generally right. We need to start looking at the business models themselves, looking at how we can demonetize this kind of viral content so that it's not in fact amplified algorithmically by these platforms, because the whole model is set up to do that kind of work because that's how they make their money. So I think that's an interesting discussion we're going to have as we review our own Online Safety Act to look at some of these problems and possibly introduce our own bill looking at targeting mis and disinfo and giving regulators powers to take that down.
So you look at it more through the misinfo, disinfo sort of platform responsibility than the online safety deal with a bad thing by coming up with tough new laws, do you?
Well, I think these things are fluid and they're covered in different ways in respectively the UK and Australia. But how this issue has been largely framed is that there was a misattribution of the cause of that violence that occurred with young girls being murdered at a Taylor Swift event being attributable to migrants at large, and this was fueled by influencers. So it's come under the topic of mis and disinfo. I'm not sure that's an accurate description, but I can understand that that's the vehicle through which regulators think about it. I think there's a broader concern that people ought to have around how we use immigrants as scapegoats, but this is hardly a new problem, and it's also hardly something that's confined to social media. So there's a bigger problem politically in the UK with this kind of racism and the like. But there's lots of people who remain very concerned about the prospect of giving regulators takedown powers for mis and disinfo. When I talk to my colleagues in civil society in India, for example, there's a similar law, which I think is interesting, and it requires that essentially fake news be taken down if it's about the ruling administration, about the government. And they're all appalled by this because they consider it to be authoritarian. So powers that are described as being important for online safety in places like Australia and the UK are perceived as being authoritarian in places like India. And I think there is a real question around that. Online safety rules, if implemented too broadly, have the potential to be used in very powerful ways that do impact how we have public discussions. And I think we should be cautious about handing too much power to regulators, especially in a country like Australia where we don't have a human rights regime that can temper some of those excessive powers of regulators.
Dan, I don't know how deep you'd went into that story, but the other thing that just strikes me is that the calls to regulate the platforms as opposed to the pushback on any form of regulation of the media and the way the two of them work in almost concert seems to be a mismatch.
Yeah, and you combine that with the algorithms that are amplifying the content, which we don't really have full visibility over. I think I share. Well, it feels to me like the Online Safety Act is being asked to do a job which is just too big to ever be successful. It concerns me off the back of this story for a couple of reasons.
It's like a water regulator having to deal with climate change.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
Jeannie here.
So
you jump in, Jeannie.
I was just going to say, no, I won't, I'm the guest. I'll let Dan finish his
Take
sentence.
over, Phil.
All I was going to say was the English example is a bit of a crossover, though, because it started with misinformation, disinformation, but it quickly has moved into amplifying riots, which is squarely in the realm of the Online Safety Act. And so it's sort of an example of misinformation slides into rage and fury, and at some point we do want that taken down. I mean, that there's misinformation is used to drum up ethnic hate. Basically, it's done that in lots of places, and I'm also worried about the use of online safety acts and the like to censor people who have unpopular opinions, because that's how it'll be used, right? But equally, I do have some faith that we can distinguish between material that's palpably wrong, right, and material that's politically contentious. Now, maybe we need to reframe the Act to be able to do that, but I think there is a difference between those two types of statements.
You can jump in, Dan, or else segue into your special subject, or a little bit of both, maybe.
Maybe I'll try a bit of both. Look, I've got two concerns about what's happened since this story broke. The first one, I think you touched on, Lizzie, and that it feels like the story quickly became all about the response to this online, and I guess the media picking up on that response, and not potentially some of the root causes of some of this. By the way, I'm not in any way excusing it, in any, like, just to be clear, but it feels like it's quite a convenient way to frame the problem if you just blame the digital platforms for all this. That being said, I think they do have a massive role to play, and I would rather see a system which goes even further. I mean, to pick up on what Frances Haugen was saying, which goes even further up the chain to the root of the problem, which is, rather than targeting individuals and for problematic posts, I mean, there's probably a role to play for that too. But really, we don't really know off the back of this. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but we don't really know off the back of this how much this content was amplified, and therefore how much the digital platforms actually contributed to the response that followed. And, as usual, the platforms will say nothing, and they're just a dumb pipe, and it's got nothing to do with them. But obviously their algorithms amplified this. And to your point, Lizzie, it's because of the business model. So I think I would like to see something closer to an algorithm charter like they have in New Zealand as a way of dealing with this, but not just for government platforms, but something which is also for private enterprises like Facebook and the like. And therefore, we'd have some visibility over what's happening, because I think if we did, we'd get a sense of how much the platforms were responsible for this kind of thing, and therefore what the potential remedy could be.
That's the Digital Services Act in the EU, which does actually ask for that type of transparency. And I think it's interesting today, I heard that the EU Internal Markets Commissioner sent a warning to Elon Musk to be prepared to remove violent and illegal content, right, from the platforms. That's not targeting individuals. That's saying where you, the platform, know that material is false, you need to, and dangerous, because I think it's a double criteria, you have to take it down. Elon Musk went, no way, that's infringing my free speech. So it is a really, even if you go further back, it's still a difficult debate.
Speaking of Elon, he has been curating a bit of original content over the last day, Dan.
Yes, you provided a fantastic segue, so thank you for that. The story I want to talk about is one that's very new, or at least new at the time of this recording, and that's today Elon Musk interviewed Donald Trump on X, formerly Twitter. And at the time of this recording, I had a look just a moment ago, and Musk was bragging that it had over 1 billion streams already. So look, I'll spare you the content of the interview.
Yeah,
1 billion.
How many of those were bots?
Just his children?
Yeah. I think we can all take what Elon says with a pinch of salt, just as we should with Donald Trump. Look, I'm going to spare you.
We've got to wait 40 minutes before we talk again, just to get into the vibe of the. No, you can keep going.
Look, it was a 2-hour interview, right? And Trump covered all of his greatest hits. He did speak an awful lot about the assassination attempt on him, even though he said he wasn't going to do it anymore. He banged on about illegal immigration, the 2020 election steal, all of the usual lies that followed. But what I find interesting about this story is really just the political strategy that is underpinning Musk doing this and how it's being embraced by the tech bros in the US. So this appearance followed Trump appearing on the All In podcast, which some listeners might know. That's a conservative podcast out of Silicon Valley with people like Jason Calacanis and David Sachs and a few other very prominent Trump supporters. And it also follows Trump appearing at the Bitcoin 2024 conference in Nashville last month. So look, I've been reading lots of reporting, particularly in the New York Times, on Trump's campaign strategy. I suspect I'm like many other people, I'm completely obsessed with US politics at the moment. But his theory of winning, or his strategy for winning, if you like, is targeting the roughly 10% of the voting population that are undecided in the swing states. And that population skews male, skews under 40, doesn't read mainstream media, so-called low information voters. They tend to hold some form of cryptocurrency in some capacity. I think 40% of the US population owns some form of cryptocurrency now. So you can see in that context, you can understand why Trump is embracing this.
That's like oxycodone numbers.
I know.
It's I guess a bit of a virus. Full disclosure, I also own quite a bit of cryptocurrency, but we'll move on.
The contagious?
We'll see.
Only if it works.
Yeah, not yet. Anyway, don't hold your breath. Anyway, I think what's interesting, right, though, is that Trump's going after these voters, and he's doing so with interviews with people like Musk and people like David Sachs. And look, they're not journalists, right? Like they are people that effectively just are barracking for him and doing so on platforms which literally have tens of millions, and in Elon's case, hundreds of millions, if not a billion, people that view it. And so Trump is free to sort of say whatever he wants and doesn't get any pushback or fact checking or whatever else. Now, this isn't new, but I think the scale that it is taking place in this election is new. And it's also coming off the back of Elon Musk, who recently tweeted a satirical video, but nonetheless a deep fake video of Kamala Harris saying all kinds of outrageous things, which were not very favorable, or didn't paint her in a very favorable light. So look, I guess I'm interested in the contrast between Donald Trump, who is sort of targeting, these alternative media sources and reaching people that don't consume any other form of media, versus Kamala Harris, who has had this, amazing start to her campaign, and certainly the mainstream media has embraced her in a massive way, even though she hasn't done a formal interview yet with any of them. And my worry is that Trump's going to end up being the more astute one. Now, it doesn't look that way, judging by the polls, of which, Kamala's getting ahead of Trump now, but it is going to be a real test, I think, to determine just how much influence this new media has versus the mainstream media, and whether it is able to sway those undecided voters.
Wow, that's a take. Lizzie?
My only query to you, Dan, is that don't they have a different job? Like, Trump's got to recruit undecideds to come and vote for him, or numbers, and Kamala has to get people out who are prepared to do that work on the ground for her in the way that the Democrats traditionally organize. And those people have been alienated from Biden. They probably had a position on the genocide in Gaza that they weren't pretty happy with Biden about, and they're waiting to see how Kamala, or Harris, I should say, is going to respond to that more fulsomely. And that's her job, to kind of recruit those people who are traditional party activists. So you don't necessarily do that through online platforms. I do think there's probably a slightly different ground game. But I do understand their concern around, I think that their Trump policy is data informed. It's not foolish, because it has to be, because I think that's one of the things that they used effectively in the election that he was successful in winning. Through using that kind of profiling technique, and that Obama had started and he built upon. So it's true to form, I think, and it is the strategy that he's got to pursue. But I think there are different approaches to finding a route home to the White House. No?
Yeah, and look, my suspicion is he's probably not going to win, and a strategy like that would never work in a country like Australia, which has compulsory preferential voting. But in a country like America, where it is really, a half a dozen swing states that are deciding the outcome of the election, it's just the trend of people away from mainstream media towards this alternative media, or whatever you want to call it, is growing, right? And so you just wonder whether the strategy is right of Trump going after these undecided voters that don't read the New York Times or don't read the Wall Street Journal or whatever else, or don't watch cable TV, versus what
just about
Kamala is
everyone.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that strikes me though is if Trump is all in on, the tech bros, the concern on the Democrat side is that Harris is a lot more Silicon Valley than Biden, and that some of those terrific appointments that have had a real impact now, like we're not talking about the case on Google and antitrust this week, but it is significant, and we've spoken about it previously. And if he gets rid of those appointees like Lena Khan, Tim Wu, is it? Like that, the cost of holding on might be pretty devastating to the broader project of regulating of tech. I don't know if you've got a take on that one, Jeannie, or a take on US in general, but everyone does.
I hope, but I don't have any intel, that Silicon Valley is wise enough to realize that a country under Trump's probably not one that's going to work for them in the long time. Musk is kind of the outlier in that place, in that way, I think. Most of the Silicon Valley bros enjoy living in California, which is almost like a separate country in terms of liberal democratic values, I think. That's my hope, anyway.
All right, it's only one step along. I want to outline a big crazy idea that isn't mine. It's actually one that's been aired today in some of the media around Audrey Tang's trip to Australia. Audrey being the former Taiwanese digital minister, who is doing a few talks around Australia and over the next couple of days. But they're part of a group from the States called Project Liberty, which has got a plan, quite well funded and quite well organised, as I've discovered, to launch a people's takeover of TikTok. There's a few things going on there, and it's really a three-shot play. The first one is they are building distributive data with the idea that it can be scaled. The second is they're running a political inside game in the States to get the forced divestment of TikTok. And then the third is to raise money to take that and then use that as an entry point to run or offer citizens a platform where they have more control of the algorithm. There is all those principles that a lot of us are talking about rebuilding civic democracy or civil democracy. And it would be quite revolutionary if they could pull it off. Now, I don't know if they can, but I'm interested, particularly the natural skeptic that is Lizzie O'Shea and the enthusiasm of Dan, about where you think, whether that's something that sounds like it's got a through story, or does it feel like a thought bubble?
I'm trying to get excited about this idea on one level, because I understand that if we're talking about the need to build alternatives, that involves repurposing things that already exist, but also not just requiring the government do it, and like a government-run Google, I think, as the Greens proposed one time a few years ago, as an alternative to the search engine to deal with the competition issue. And I understand the appeal of something like this. I just remain a bit concerned when we tap out one set of billionaires for other sets of billionaires, I suppose, is my worry in terms of how we shape those alternatives. But it's difficult to criticize it in a context in which I think the other kinds of alternatives that could be created require long-term government investment in basic infrastructure.
Or a network effect, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, that might lead to a network effect, for example. So there's ways that you can create the conditions for that to occur in organic ways, but they are longer term, and it feels like we're a long way from that. So, who am I to criticize someone having a go via this method? But I find it hard to shake some of that cynicism, I have to say.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting how it plays. It probably is contingent on the result in the presidential elections, but I think with the geopolitical overlay, like there is genuine concern in a number of countries on how TikTok operates, the lack of transparency on where data's going or how it works. I know we've said it before, is it any worse than any other platform? Probably one that has ties into a government like China's has questions that should be asked, particularly when so many people are using it. But also what's interesting about Audrey's take on it is it's not so much the damage it's doing, but the opportunity to do good if there was a people's takeover of a big platform and the rules were set by disaggregated communities to then build their own experiences off the back of it. So still potentially video content, but not a constant stream, one that you could choose what you were getting and as creators, how you reached out. And so you can sort of see that kind of whole public square, particularly in the arts and for curation, being something that's quite interesting. So I don't know if you've got your head around it, Dan, or if you've got any thoughts or questions about
Oh, look,
it.
I'm not going to surprise you. I'm the naive optimist, or the whatever. You can label me something much more pejorative later on. But look, I love this. I love it for a couple of reasons. I love it because it's only possible if ByteDance is forced to divest from TikTok, which we've sparred on before, but I'm massively in favour on and think should happen. I won't prosecute that argument again. But so that's the first thing. And it also, it's what Audrey is describing is pretty similar to this kind of crazy idealistic discussion that we had with Tracy Spicer a few weeks back, where we were talking about giving people much greater control over the algorithm of these platforms, which they spend so much time on. And look, at the time that we were talking about this, it was all very lovely, but it sounded like a complete and utter pipe dream, which had no possibility of ever coming to life. And here's a way where I actually can see the potential for it to come to life. And sure, it's not perfect. It's billionaires swapping for other billionaires, but nonetheless, the way that they're talking about making this platform much more open, much more in the hands of its users, and potentially building a community, I think is something which is really exciting. And I hope it will happen. Here's the thing, though. That platform is worth so much damn money. I just can't see that this is ever going to be able to compete with the real money that's going to come in and try and take control of this, because this is one of the most valuable platforms or applications in the world, and it is only growing in popularity. And I just can't see a group like this with altruistic ends in mind ever being able to compete with the private sector. So I hope I'm wrong, but let's see.
You can only run a platform if you're evil, Jeannie. Sorry. You interested? Want a stake in TikTok?
Probably share the cynicism of we're trading one big owner for another. Also, sort of, I guess, by confession, I have made TikTok videos.
Oh, you might be the only one on this panel.
Yeah, it was COVID entertainment.
Interesting. Okay, everyone can look you up, Jeannie.
We look forward to going back and looking that up, Jeannie. We'll report back.
Well, let's talk to you about your work now, Jeannie, because Lizzie suggested we get you on. I think you bumped into each other either in a conference or a courtroom. I'm not sure which, Lizzie, but talking before the show, what I'm very excited about is your work on companion technology. Who needs a cat? Who needs a child when you can program a piece of technology to service all your emotional needs, right? It sounds like fantastic, exciting work. So sell it to me.
Well, I really like chatbots, and I've liked chatbots before chatbots were fashionable. And chatbots are in our lives, they're in our homes, they're influencing how we behave. And the EU AI Act, which everybody triumphs as the bastion of regulation for AI, puts those technologies, the technologies we use intimately and in our homes, generally as low-risk technologies. They don't take them seriously. They don't take them seriously. Why? Because they're in our houses, or they're looking after our children or our old people. I think that's interesting. To the extent they use generative AI, there's some disclosure obligations. But if you committed to be in love with a avatar or a robot cat or whatever, a disclosure, this is virtual, isn't going to change your mind. So I think they're worth much more attention, and they have consumer protection implications too.
So that's really your discipline, isn't it? Consumer protection. So tell us a little bit about that and how you see that intersecting with tech regulation and the sorts of discussions we like.
Can I just intercede as well to give a slight further introduction to Jeannie, which is I described Jeannie to Peter when I was suggesting her for this podcast as somebody who made me feel sorry for corporations, which may come as some surprise, but it's partly because when we were talking, and we've often chatted about AI regulation because Jeannie's field is like product liability, consumer protections, these kinds of things. She made the valid point that at least in respect of AI, that companies are held to higher standards through product liability laws in ways that governments often manage to avoid. And that occurred to me as a huge practical challenge of AI regulation. What do you do about bad applications in government, and how do you create better rules to protect people? So I think that was quite a success, Jeannie, there in making me eat my hat a bit. But Jeannie is a professor at Melbourne Uni and has done a lot of work around AI regulation, but particularly around consumer protection. So yeah, maybe you want to launch into your feelings about emotional tech and consumer protection.
Well, I'm tempted to go down the government pathway, but I won't. So consumers are actually at the forefront of changes in technology, and sometimes consumer protection law is kind of dismissed as a poor cousin of competition policy or a weak version of corporations law because it's a sort of regulation of corporations. But the consumer protection movement grew out of a civil liberties movement, particularly in the US, right? And in Europe, it is very tied to human rights. And in the US, it's tied to civil liberties because every citizen is a consumer. So how we're treated in the marketplace is, I think, really important to how we enjoy our civic rights. And the other thing about consumer law is often the sums of money that are in dispute are quite small, so they're easily trivialised. But actually, for ordinary people, small amounts of money are quite significant, particularly at times like this when the cost of living is increasing. So that's why I'm a consumer protection lawyer. I really got excited in this because I was at some government discussion group where they made the comment, we were talking about people who ran out of money and couldn't get loans or couldn't get short-term finance. And somebody said, but how much are we talking about? And I said, well, 300 for a fridge. Doesn't everybody have that in their wallet?
Sorry. Oh, God. Oh,
No,
God.
they don't. So that's me. And then AI is been used predominantly in relation to citizens and consumers. So that's where my interest has arisen there. And I'm particularly interested in the AI in our homes or in our private spaces, I guess. So that started with things like the Ring doorbell that you can use to watch who's on the street, or Siri or Amazon's Alexa that are in your house talking to you and selling you things. And that's now moved into our relationships with virtual avatars that we may be interacting with through our devices to give us advice about how to live healthy lives or to stop us being lonely.
Jeannie, in that circumstance, help me understand how consumer protection can help. So one of the things that I have been reading about recently, or read about recently, I think it was a Guardian story. I can't remember the name of the company, to be honest, but it was effectively a company which sold AI chatbots in a real world example of the movie Her, right? Like basically sold them to people. They knew they were artificial. They knew it was not a real person, but nonetheless, there's a whole bunch of people, at least, who were profiled in this article and on the subsequent podcast that, we were genuinely very attached to these bots effectively. And like the whole thing creeped me out. Like I think it would probably creep out most people. But, for these people, it was actually really meaningful. And what I was concerned about in listening to this is just the power that that company ultimately has over these individuals. So help me understand. I mean, is this something that you've considered? Could consumer protections give some protection to these people? Because it's almost certainly going to keep growing in terms of adoption, right?
Yeah. No, that's right. So I think the company you're talking about is Replica. And actually, your previous guest, Tracy Spicer, has talked and written about Replica, which has been around for a while. So Replica is your AI companion who cares. And Replica is not the only AI companion. There's a number of them that have millions and millions of followers. And how it works is you, the consumer, buys a subscription online to a website, and then you get to create Yes, create your ideal companion. You decide how they look, what their hobbies are, what their personality is, and then that AI companion interacts with you. Now, they're usually quite a clever design because the AI companion is not totally predictable in their responses. They have a little bit of quirkiness in them, but ultimately the companion is created by you, for you, which is the ick factor. Now, there's been quite a number of controversies about these AI companions in terms of the relationship with the person who's purchased them. And they go from the sort of existential philosophical about what is the relationship that we should have with an online avatar to the quite practical, because in the example of Replica, and probably the article you was talking about, at one point, Replica did a software update and the personality of everybody's replica, their AI companion, was lost. They lost the personality of that companion, the one who had sort of been trained by interacting with them, and they kind of had to start again. And people said they were absolutely bereft about this, which is kind of, you know, we might laugh, but it also shows, I think, the sort of manipulative element of this purchase, because it's kind of mutually reinforcing. The user of the replicas kind of designed their ideal companion, but that companion has been programmed to just be difficult enough as to keep the user.
But is it marketed as your partner or as your helper? Like, because it seems like not far from those sort of automated therapy apps. Like,
it's very close to therapy apps. That's actually how I started looking at it, because I actually started looking at therapy apps. But so let's talk about the consumer protection questions. There's a wealth of consumer protection questions. So, and they start with, what is it that you're actually contracting for? Can they turn it off? What do you lose if they turn it off? Then they move forward to, is it actually good for you? Is it fit for purpose, or is it harmful? And then they move into questions of, is it actually manipulating who you are? And should we be worried about that in a legal sense? So there's reams and reams of legal and, as I said, philosophical questions.
Does the manipulation have to be negative? Like, what if it's manipulating you positively?
I'm one of those people that thinks any manipulation is not positive, because in fact that what we should be doing when we're thinking about our interactions with other people is building opportunities for autonomous decision making, for agency. So I'm of that school that says sort of nudge theory gives me the I'm not fond of it, and so I think yes, any manipulation is problematic. And this also is not this is not designed to help us live more healthy lives. It's designed to keep us company. And what does it mean to have an artificial agent keeping you company? Now, as you mentioned before, there's disclosures. People know that the agent is artificial, though some people have given them bodies by using effectively sex robots. But the users know that the companion is artificial. So there's no misleading conduct here, as there is in some other situations, but we still might worry about that relationship of dependency that's being built up between the avatar, run by a private company that is acting for profit, and the individual who's looking to the avatar for companionship. Now, that companionship might be quirky sometimes, it might be offensive to us sometimes, but they're still looking for companionship that they've somehow purchased, but with very little recourse about what that companionship means for them, or whether it'll even continue.
Yeah, that's one thing I wonder, because the idea of co-creation does imply that you've got some form, you've invested in this through creating it yourself, through shaping it through your own preferences, but you have no ownership over it. And whether that's in a way misleading, because even if you know it's artificial, you can still think it belongs to you. And the reality is that it's not possible to protect it from deletion, whether it's inadvertent or deliberate. But also, if you don't want to pay for it, it's not yours. So it's a service. It's not actually an item that you buy. So it's not like journaling and you've kept a diary and you own the diary, or correspondence that you've maintained when you've got hard copies of. That's what I think is also partly the element of of deception, I suppose, that the assumption of your co-creation in such an intimate setting, I think gives people a sense of entitlement to ownership that is completely absent and not disclosed.
Well,
Whatever,
it's not disclosed, but
Would
I'm
it
going
be in the ticker box, wouldn't it?
Oh,
The
yeah, but
consent
we know
form?
that people don't read that. That's quite right. Okay, so that's a fair point. People might not realize how vulnerable it is, but I'm going to push that further. It's promoted as your AI companion, your companion who's cared. Should we own an AI companion anyway? Should we even think we own an AI companion? That's what's so interesting. You're stuck between these really unpleasant alternatives. So if it's just a service, then the AI companion can disappear, causing hurt and upset to the person who's been using the service. But if the user owns the companion, they're not owning a person, and AI is not a person, but they're owning something that resembles a person and who they're interacting with a person. And what does that mean for them and for society that people might purchase an online person to interact with? That's, to me, that's problematic too. And I think the way we behave online and our interaction with online avatars actually does shape how we understand the online world and how we understand our relationships with humans. We need to do more research in this, and this is one of the areas where people are starting to do research. But at this point in time, I think we need to think really carefully about consumer protection, but consumer protection not just in the did I get a product that broke, but consumer protection in the sense of, are we looking after the best interests of consumers and the people they deal with?
So picking up on that point, Jeannie, and perhaps coming full circle, is there a role for consumer protections to play in minimizing the harm of other algorithmic creations like what we've been talking about specifically on social media? We've talked about this a lot in the context of privacy reform and transparency and trying to minimize the harm from targeted advertising. But to the best of my recollection, at least, I don't think we've talked about using consumer protection laws as a way to potentially help consumers from being manipulated by these algorithms and, to bad ends where they are definitely, as we saw in the UK recently, at least having some influence over what's happening to people who are consuming the content. Is there an avenue where we could use this law to strengthen the protections for consumers here?
Yeah, there is, if we chose to take it. And if we can overcome a few jurisdictional hurdles. So, in fact, we talk about the harm that's done to consumers through social media or digital platforms, and we can think about it in terms of privacy. Privacy in Australia, as you all know, is premised very much on consent and notice. Consumer law actually has long been suspicious of consent and notice, and is often actually doesn't consider formal manifestations of consent and notice and looks over those requirements to see, the benefit of the product for the individual, and also whether there's been reasons why we should disregard consent. Consumer law is quite paternalistic in some ways, which, to be honest, I don't see as a criticism. So platforms are manipulative. Their whole purpose is to manipulate us in various ways. Some people will be manipulated in more odious ways than others. Can we use consumer law to protest that? Well, in fact, Andrew Forrest is doing that at the moment, and so is the ACCC. So in the US, platforms are protected by the something Act, the Online something Act, which is a name I can't remember, which says that they actually can't be sued in tort or in contract. They're kind of immune. They're simply They're simply supposed to be treated as vessels through which conduits for information. In Australia, we don't have that limitation. In fact, a platform can be sued. There's no immunity to it. The defence that those platforms have at the moment is that they didn't know if there was manipulative or misleading conduct taking place on them. But that notion is being challenged. That constitutionally related protection in the US that says a digital platform is immune from tort action is also actually being challenged, because people are saying, well, that's fine in terms of the traditional understanding of news, a platform or a news agency shouldn't be responsible for simply sharing information, but where they're using the platform for commercial ends that they themselves are controlling and promoting quite deliberately through the use of an algorithm, that sort of idea of constitutional free speech protections for distributors of information kind of falls away. So in the US, the idea is being challenged, and in Australia, the idea is being challenged. We're just waiting for it to work through the courts. Wow.
I know. You're the lawyer.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think,
Where does
oh, go on, sorry.
where do you see consumer law fitting into the fabric? You know, your class action, you got your privacy enforcement.
Well, lots of class actions are consumer law class actions that involve using protections to recover compensation for people who've been misled by companies in trade or commerce, or been subject to unfair contract terms, or whatever it may be. So I think it's a hugely important component of the law, and one of the key ways in which companies are regulated, as well as on obligations on directors and the like. But it's often kind of, seen as a poor cousin. But I suppose what I would say is one of the challenges with some of these kind of consumer protection claims is that, or kind of instinctive claims where the product appears dangerous, causes harm, but it's difficult to draw a line between those two things. And also the product is legal, and you can think about things like tobacco, which we know kills you, or asbestos, which we know kills you. I mean, asbestos is now banned, but also the gambling, which we know is very, very harmful, but is still lawful. So there's a question around what you do around products that we know are harmful, but we still allow to occur. And that creates this idea that then individuals might be responsible for their own actions. And this is always the tension in how we regulate these products. To what extent do we hold people responsible for their own actions, and to what extent do we consider the kind of manipulation they're subject to unacceptable? And these things progress over time. So it's not as though it's a static idea of what is and isn't acceptable in society, but it makes litigating in this space somewhat challenging. So I think, you do need good laws, not just good litigators.
As a bush lawyer, isn't the other problem that on the platforms, we are the product? So when the service is free, consumer law wouldn't apply?
No, that's not right at all. So
Good. Thank you.
sorry.
Yeah.
Putting it out there.
I submit. I object.
Just to go back to I'm going to go back to the gambling example, because that's a really good example. So there have been actions brought. There's been a number of actions brought by people who've been subject to manipulative gambling practices, claiming that they were either misled or that the conduct of the gambling house, I guess, for want of a better word, was unconscionable because it took advantage of their addiction to gambling. And those have actually been dismissed by courts. And courts have said, well, you haven't shown causation, or you haven't proved that the harm was due to the gambling platform or the gambling place, this casino, as opposed to your own choice to gamble, which is a really sort of puritanical approach to gambling, which is it's with you, the gambler, not the gambling house which was sitting there flashing its lights at you. You made the decision to go in. So there's definitely a puritanical element there, and consumer law is very much affected by mainstream social values. And that's a good example of where actually consumer protection hasn't been successful, but that it has been successful in other places. I think consumer law has been very good on product liability. And I think consumer law can be very good on managing platforms, managing AI, because the standards are directed at the performance of the product. And that's precisely where we can sort of snap in and go, well, actually, the performance of the product is poor. That covers replica. But I think it, to some extent, can also cover at least misinformation, dangerous misinformation or problematic misinformation on platforms, if we can get over the hurdle of they're not mere conduits of information.
But isn't the difference there, though, and the reason why there's been success on consumer protection for these products is that they are physical products that you can see, that you can analyze, that you can see the harms really directly. Whereas when it comes to the platforms, the algorithms are completely opaque. It's impossible to actually, for a consumer to ever actually know for certain how much harm is being caused by that. And by the way, picking up on the gambling example, that's also the case, right? Because a lot of these online gambling tools have such high amounts of manipulation that take place in them, but it's really difficult to see that in the moment, or certainly after the fact. Whereas, you know, a toothpaste that is poisonous is easy to see and easy to assess. It's a very different scenario. It just feels like it's a much more uphill battle in this environment.
Yes and no. I think it is, but I think I still think there's opportunities that can act. So at the moment, before the High Court of Australia is the case of a education provider that was getting a subsidy of government to provide training courses to people who were low income, who dropped out of school early, and so on. Now, the education provider contracted out recruitment, and the recruiters went out and lied to the potential students, gave them free laptops and told them that they would get a free education when in fact it was on fee help. Now, that's not palpable, but enough evidence was collected, enough statistical evidence actually was collected to show that this was a system of conduct or pattern of behaviour which can then be shown to be unconscionable under the consumer law. So, in fact, consumer law, yes, it works best with physical products that harm us, but it does also deal with those more those harms to agency on autonomy, or those harms to respect for other people. So if we can make those arguments in the digital space, I think there is a lot of opportunity there.
So a lot of areas of law, there's that tension between the laws need to be updated versus the laws just need to be applied to new technology. Where does consumer law fit on that continuum? Are the laws fit for purpose and it's just about will, or is there things that need to be changed?
I think the law in consumer protection can do a lot more. There's some definitions we need to change. It can do a lot more, but we need privacy protection as well. I mean, we just need privacy protection. I know Lizzie thinks that. We just need privacy protection.
We all think that.
Yeah, okay. Just need privacy protection. We cannot do without privacy protection. Consumer protection is, you're quite right, it's about trade and commerce. It's about our dealings in the market. Privacy protection is broader than that, right? And we need, if we can have good privacy protection, we choke some of the model of digital platforms, and we choke some of the model of the more offensive technologies that we see. And then consumer law kind of acts as the safety net for products that do come onto the market, having complied with privacy law, but we still find are harmful or manipulative. But
so can I ask you then, Jeannie, about AI regulations in particular? I mean, it's hard to talk about AI regulation because AI is used to cover so many things, right? But when you have an automated decision-making process, one of the problems is you may not know that you've been treated unfairly. I mean, do you think there's a role to play in creating an obligation if you're using an automated decision-making process to treat people fairly, or a protection against unfair treatment by an automated decision-making process, you know, with the requisite levels of it not being too minimal, but as in it's got to be something substantive in terms of the unfairness. But I do wonder about that as a specific update to consumer law. I mean, it's possible that a lot of these bad uses of AI or discriminatory uses are covered by other forms of either discrimination legislation or also existing consumer protections. But one of the key problems, I think, is the lack of transparency in how these decisions are made. And if you're subject to them, both identifying that at the outset without putting any obligations on the companies to proactively mitigate that risk seems like a problem that we could potentially fix. But I wonder what you think about that.
I think transparency is really fundamental. And I think if you have transparency in those decision-making processes, you're right, you can use other rules. But guess what? Most businesses are under various fairness obligations in their dealings with consumers. Who isn't? The government. Like, seriously, if we change consumer protection law and say, and I actually think we can get there, but I'm with you, sometimes we need law to be clear rather than rely on clever lawyers' arguments about how we can do things. I think uses of automated decision making should be transparent, and I think people who are subject to automated decision making should be treated fairly. But consumer protection law applies to trade and commerce. That's not government. What's the law that's going to require government to comply by those same standards? We have recommendations of the Ombudsman, but to my mind, those aren't, as far as I know, those aren't binding on government departments. about how automated decision making is used. So yes, but what about government? How do we make those standards also apply to government?
I got one last question before we wind up for you, Jenny.
I want to know what Lizzie thinks about that one.
Oh, well, okay. You
laughing. She's got an answer.
Oh, like I
Yeah.
completely agree with you. I mean, I think one of the problems as well is we don't have a human rights act. We don't have a human rights culture, right? Because then individuals who usually a minority who have been harmed by this system, including by government, would be able to agitate for that through courts, because that obligation to rights exists across all government departments, across, so that's the other mechanism that exists, a human rights framework that is enforceable, because then it forces governments to think about it in designing their systems. It has the pointy end of litigation to enforce those rights. But at the moment, nothing like that exists. And it is sort of a lacuna that is not, we, as the only liberal democracy without a Bill of Rights, we're starting to drift from similar regimes, and it's a problem. It creates bad government practices as well as, lower quality markets for private services and products.
Yeah, absolutely agree. That's why the Privacy Act's really important too.
Totally, as a human right, for sure.
Yep.
Back to my final question. You and whose army? Like, who cares enough to push this on? Because like so many of these bits, the interest to stop the change, as we're seeing in privacy, are so strong and so well organised, and we're not. How do you take these conversations more broadly out to consumers?
Education, actually. I'm an academic. Of course I'm going to say education. But it's not my decision to make how people, what sort of rights people want to have, or how they enforce them. But people can't make those decisions unless they know. People have to know what the effective automated systems, digital technology, AI is. They've got to feel confident about talking about it, and they've got to understand the opportunities for rights-based discussions to give them back autonomy, agency, allow them to be treated fairly. So I actually think it's conversations with civil society that actually change things. I'm very optimistic about that. I mean, I know I teach university students who are not representative about society, but people say young people don't care about privacy, but they do. They do care about privacy. They're just sometimes powerless.
The answer is clearly that we need to get millions and millions of people to listen to this podcast. I think that would solve all the world's ills.
Or could we get the podcast syndicated into one of the intimate organized, like could we get in
Twitter
the
space,
algorithm, and then they're listening with their intimate partner
into a
us?
replica.
Now there's an idea. Big thinking on burning platforms as ever. On that note, it's late. Thanks, Jenny. Terrific discussion. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Dan. We'll be back in a fortnight. I think a lot's going to be happening between now and then, but we'll talk again soon. And that was Burning Platforms, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. It was recorded on August 13 and produced on Lamb Land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.